Yama Warami Willimbimbi Warami Midiga Warami Daruga Nura Warami Walameta Warami Wanura Walametical. We welcome you on behalf of the ancestors, and we acknowledge all of the elders past and present. We acknowledge all Aboriginal nations of Australia. We walk together on this land and we pay respects to the traditional owners and those who have walked before us. We acknowledge the land's history, yesterdays, todays and tomorrows. The land speaks of the Darug and their dreaming. We can still feel, hear and see the ancient songlines across this beautiful campus. This land has held many gatherings for centuries, since the Darug's first sunrise some 60,000 years ago. We belong to the land. We are many nations, many people, coming together, looking after this country and respecting each other. We stand here together at Macquarie on sacred ground. As the Wallamai navigate the mangroves and find their pathways, so shall you here at Macquarie. Warami, welcome to Wallamata Juju Goyanu.
Welcome everyone to week 4. It seems like a few people had a big Anzac Day, but thank you guys so much for coming tonight. We know it's different being on a Thursday. So quickly, first things first, ladies' toilets are just round to the left and the gents are round to the right. We're also filming this session, so if you don't want to be on camera, please just let us know. We can move you to a spot in the room that you won't be filmed. So I would now love to introduce you all to our speakers this evening, Priyanka and Grant. Priyanka is a health tech manager with experience in medical devices, biopharmaceuticals and digital health. She believes in leveraging empathy to design and launch patient-centric health tech products. She works as the product manager at Emotiv, pioneers of high-quality mobile EEG technology and brain wearables. She has worked at Fortune 500 companies and startups, recently managing a digital health profile valued at $10 million for a newly listed ASX startup. With work experience in India, Germany, the US and Australia, she understands the vital role that culture plays in an organisational leadership. Now on to you, Grant. So Grant is the founder and CEO of Superestate. Superestate is a superannuation fund that has created a new way for all Australians to access the residential property market. Prior to founding Superestate, Grant worked for Optiva Asia Pacific as a corporate strategy manager. Prior to this, he worked in investment banking for the Bank of America in both Sydney and New York. So I'd like to invite Priyanka up first, and then Grant will be on a little later. Thanks, guys.
Thank you, Ali, for the lovely introduction. And thank you all for coming in. I know it feels a bit like Monday because of the day off yesterday, so everyone's a bit disoriented. But thanks for coming in anyways. And over the next 20 minutes, I'd like to walk you through the product execution process for Emotiv, which is where I work, and tell you how it's sometimes wonderful, but mostly a painful process. But once you have the right checklists and the work frames and the workflows ready, then it may not be as painful as it should or is. So when people ask me what I do and where I work, I tell them I work at Emotiv, which is a neurotech or a neuroinformatics company, and I get some strange looks. Then I go on to add that I work at a company where there are products that let you read someone else's mind, that lets a neuroscience researcher look into your brain and understand what's going on, and more importantly, use the power of your thoughts to move objects. That's when I get some really strange looks. So here is a little video of the things we do at Emotiv. Let's see. So that's us at Emotiv and all the technologies we offer. Certainly a really, really cool place to work for. Now here's a little backstory of how Emotiv came about. The co-founders were hoping to improve BCI, which is the brain-computer interface, and looked at all the traditional EEG acquisition devices out there in the market. And what they saw were traditional hairnets, like you can see in the picture, where the subject has to sit still in a lab, is hooked up to a multitude of sensors, and cannot really move much. So it wasn't a really good environment for a person to be mobile. And that's where they came up with the idea of building a portable neuro headset so that people could have better BCI experiences. And with excellent product execution, a hairnet, which also is very costly, by the way, turned into this 14-channel headset that was Neuro Headset's first portable, cost-effective device. And that's how Emotiv really came about. Very cool, huh? So imagine now that you are a product leader at Emotiv and your CEO has just walked up to you to say, we want to push this design even more. We now want to tap into the commercial market and reach consumers like you and me, and not the nerdy, geeky neuroscientists in the research labs. So let's redesign our headset with fewer channels. Let's also come up with a companion app so that consumers like you and me can understand more about their brain health. Before I kind of launch into the execution process, I really want you to understand how complex the product journey at Emotiv is. We are a full stack solution house, and what that means is that we look at hardware design, mechanical design, firmware, and software all in-house. So it's easy for someone to say, let's try a new idea. But when you come to execution, it's looking at all these components together, and then it becomes really fun, or not. So in the first 3 weeks, you learned the more upstream process, which is the customer discovery, how to take your idea, make sure that there are paying customers out there, how much are they willing to pay for your product, and also what is the convenience that will add that your product will add to the customer, as well as how will you make your product easily available to your customers. When you have responses to all these 3 questions, the ones you learned in weeks 1 to 3, is when you should move into the execution process. And here's where all my friends, the 5 W's and the 1 H, come into picture. So the first thing you should do as product leaders is understand what you're trying to build, and make sure you have a watertight definition of what the CEO expects you to build. Because if someone changes the definition from let's minimize the number of sensors to let's have a 2-sensor headset with a built-in radio, your project is doomed from the start. So make sure you know what you're building, make sure everybody on board knows what the plan is. Big picture thinking always helps, so it's important to understand why you're building the product. Why is it that we have decided to now go to the consumer market? Why is it that we have decided to make brain health more accessible to common people? The next step to define is, and most critical of the lot, is when do you expect this product to be ready? Is it in a year's time? Is it in 2 years' time? And that is a date that will be tracked by every team in your company, from the sales and the support people all the way up to senior management. The next step is, where do I build the product? Now in this example, we decided to go target consumers. And so we decided to move from a desktop-based research application to a mobile app. So we had to ask ourselves a few questions. Do we have the skill sets in-house to build a mobile app? Should we hire new developers? Should we outsource this process? Where are we going to build our product? And then who is going to be responsible for product execution? Most bigger organizations have what's called an XFT, which is a cross-functional team, and everyone from sales and marketing and engineering is involved in signing off on your product. And then our favorite question of tonight, which is, how do I build it? Well, how do you build it? You build it phase by phase. Now, every product leader's dream is to have a product launch that looks a lot like Steve Jobs and Apple and a lot less like Elon Musk and his initial SpaceX launches. You certainly don't want your product to blow up on launch day. So make sure to follow the 3-phase process. And the phases are the pre-launch process, which I call the blood, sweat, and tears process, and then the launch day, which is your SpaceX or Apple moment, and then the post-launch process, where you either regret your launch or you celebrate your launch. So let me walk you through all the phases in detail. For the pre-launch phase, we can divide it into what's called upstream process, where the product is actually designed, built, and tested. And then the downstream process, where you think about commercializing it and about distributing it. So let's look at the upstream process a bit more in detail. I'm going to walk you through how the world looks like for a hardware product owner who works alongside me and a software product owner, which I am at Emotiv at the moment. So the CEO has come up to me and said, we want to go tap into the consumer market. We want to build a consumer device. What does that mean to me as a software product owner? It means I have to build a non-scientific app. For the hardware owner, it means that he has to build a minimum channel device. And so it's important to get your ideas translated properly according to which domain that you're working in. The next step is the design prototype. Now for software, it's really easy for me to just pick up my pencil and start wireframing my ideas. Not so in the hardware world. Even with 3D printers, hardware is still a really, really complex domain. And so when they have to design a prototype, the hardware team has to do a lot of research. Everything from which kind of sensors should I be using? How many sensors is optimum sensors? Should I redesign the whole headset? It's a very complex process. So moving on to a functional prototype, this is where, as a software product owner, I feel really lucky because I can fail fast and I can fail cheap. So I can start building my software and start testing it with my end users while the hardware product owner is still in the design phase. They're still working out what's feasible, what can be built, and most of all, they now have to follow a really expensive fabrication and injection molding process. So it's not cheap to design a hardware device, certainly not quick as well, because they have to go through the whole process. And then the last part is when my idea is now a pre-production unit. In my case, I can launch my MVP or minimum viable product, because it's just a software, to a closed group of people. I can get their feedback and I can tweak my software or my app to reflect what my end users want. On the hardware side again, we're still working out what the best manufacturing process is, what my materials look like, and finally, after several iterations, come to the pre-production units. Here's how the complex hardware world looks like. This is a schematic of a real hardware that we're designing at Emotiv, and then the PCB that was a result of the schematic. On the software side, this is a designer going really fancy with how the app could look like, which was probably 2 days of work for him, so quite easy. Now on the downstream side of things, pricing. So pricing is really important because in the hardware world, pricing is what really dictates the design. Based on the price point is how you start sourcing your components. You start or design, either the cheapest possible components or the most expensive components. So price dictates everything in hardware land. On the software side, I can build my MVP and then tweak the pricing models. I can think of a free app, I can think of a paid app. It doesn't really dictate what I design. On the sales side, the hardware people have more options with reseller models or redistribution models, whereas with licensing, there's only a limited amount of things I can play with my software. For distribution, poor hardware people have so much more work to do again. They have to think about packaging, they have to think about how they're going to ship the product, they have to think about returns, whereas as a software owner, I just have to make the decision, is it iOS or Android? Do I make a free app or do I make a paid one? And then the last but the most important one is compliance. On the hardware side, you have to look at safety certifications. You have to make sure you're compliant with national standards. Whereas on the software side, I have to look at data security. As you all know, personal information and data is a big thing these days. And so you have to make sure that neuro data, or the data that we collect, is absolutely secure. And so after much sweat and tears and blood, we go from a 14-channel to a 5-channel headset. Now, this is one of the headsets that is in production for Emotiv, and it did win a design award. So kudos to the hardware team for doing so much work of translating an idea into an actual product. And this is how the software went from a very research-heavy squiggles, or EEG, brainwaves that you can see, to something that a person like you and me can understand, which is stress and engagement and excitement and focus. And then is our Apple or SpaceX moment. So this is probably the only day where you feel like you're better off being a hardware product owner because they've done all the hard work up front, pardon the bad pun. But all they have to do on launch day is make sure there's enough production units in stock, check with the suppliers if they've got enough product ready, the sales and support team trained, and the marketing collateral ready to go. But on the software side, we have something really critical called the go, no go test. And if you have a really bad day, then you just might have a no-go decision. So you have to come up with contingency plans when you're a software product owner, and also make sure your sales team and your support team knows what to do if the product does not go as planned. Post-launch. Now, to a lot of people, post-launch isn't part of the product execution journey, but to me, it's extremely important. It's extremely important to know what your customers are thinking once your product is in their hands. And so it's quite crucial to understand how the post-launch process works. There's also something called too much feedback or too little feedback. So once again, as a software product manager, I have access to a whole heap of tools to understand user metrics. I know when you've signed into my product. I know when you've downloaded the app. I know how often you use my app. But for the hardware product owner, it's like almost a black box. They have no idea who's putting on the headset, how many hours are they wearing the headset, until someone could be frustrated and returns the headset. So it's harder being a hardware manager in that case. For the returns, if someone isn't happy with the software or the app, all I need to do is think about, if they need to get their money back. But for the hardware side, you have to think about RMAs, how they can ship the product back, and pretty much all the chain to your support team. Now, we live in a really global connected world. And there are things that you don't think about but disrupt your supply chain. So as an example, it was Chinese New Year, and none of us had predicted it would slow down our hardware supply and that we would have massive supply chain impacts. Or there was a typhoon about to hit Philippines. No one could predict that, but it also meant it impacted our hardware products. On the software side, it could happen to your servers. AWS servers could go down somewhere else, and it impacts your software. So there are all the things that you have to think about in the post-execution land. And finally, there is something that is still completely out of your control, even more than typhoons and earthquakes, which is some other organization making their products obsolete. So let's say you've built your headset with a microcontroller and the company no longer supports that microcontroller. All of a sudden, your product then becomes obsolete and you have to go back to the design board. Same goes for software with browser support. So as you see, it's an ongoing cycle, and the 3 phases keep going on. You get user feedback, you feed it back in, go back to the drawing board, and start the process again. So here's a little video again to show you how the hardware was redesigned from the ground up. Hopefully. Okay.
We're pioneers in this field. We've listened to our user base and we've redesigned the product from the ground up. For anyone who loves the epoch, you'll love this product even more because we feel like we've taken not just one generational leap, but we've taken many generational leaps. We've looked at the sensor technology, we've looked at the electronics design, we've looked at the wireless communication protocol, we've looked at the overall mechanical design, we've looked at the form factor. How do we make it more affordable? How do we make it much more skeletal, much lighter weight, much easier to wear?
And I have a cool little video to share as well for the software side. So this is a lady who is trying, driving a Jaguar for the first time, and we're tracking her emotions as she test drives the Jaguar. So here we go, and she's using the new consumer app. Whoops. Okay.
Using high-tech biosensors, it measures levels such as stress, excitement, and relaxation. Traffic. So typical. Okay, so what sort of features do we have here? Temperature, heated seats, very nice. We've measured that on a typical day, these are my average levels. Let's see how I get on today.
And that's the consumer app working for you. So that was my spiel on product execution in 20 minutes. Thank you.
Perfect. So Grant
Cool.
is mic'd up, ready to go. If you guys have any more questions, there is time at the end, and you can direct them at Grant or Priyanka. So over to you, Grant.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Priyanka, that looks amazing, firstly. I'm actually pretty amazed. Some of the videos you had up there, yeah, stunning. I can't wait to see sort of where the technology is going to go in sort of 5, 10, 15 years, which, I don't know, I think in our lifetimes we've all seen Back to the Future and that stuff, but it actually is a little bit crazy that this stuff is sort of slowly coming to fruition. So yeah, I love it. So I'll make this a little bit more exciting in terms of we're talking about superannuation. I know probably everyone's going, 7 o'clock Thursday night, let's make this quick, but we'll try to keep it light and sort of easygoing. So firstly, show of hands, who in the room has superannuation? So anyone who's had a job, some super out there. Should be most people, right? Cool. So we'll do a little experiment here. This is one thing we like to do. So most people here have super. So this will explain a bit more what we are as well. Okay, so this very controversial topic right now and probably will be for the rest of our lives, Sydney house prices. So everyone in the room, you're all going to have different retirement ages. You can grab your phones out here. Normally phones away, but get your phones out. So send a text to. When you retire, it might not be 2060. For some of the younger people in the audience, it might even be beyond that. But when you retire one day, if you think Sydney house prices are going to be above or below where they are today. So I'll give you 10 seconds there.
Is that adjusted for inflation?
If you want, sure. Well, actually, sure, we'll do adjusted for inflation. Give you 10 more seconds. Okay. So it looks like we have two brave people who think that it's going to be below. Does anyone want to put their hand up? Go on in the back. Anyone else? Okay, look, well, basically the way we think about it, we take the long-term view. When we look at inflation, when we look at population growth, we actually look at a lot of different factors and we go, okay, well, whether you think it's going to be above or below, we can all agree that the price of housing is going to be very important, right? And when we look at what actually matters when you retire, you go, well, what's going to impact your standard of living as an individual, right? So when you look at what the government says, they basically say the two biggest determinants of standard of living are your income and the cost of housing. So when you get to retirement age, you obviously, the income piece kind of falls away and you've got your super and you might have some other income that's coming in from investments or whatever, but that basically leaves housing, right? Whether you own a house or you're a renter, whatever side of that equation you're on, you're going to be impacted by it. And I mean, most of us here, we've basically seen what's happened. If you're on the right side of that equation, it's played out pretty well. But even if you're on the wrong side of the equation, what it means to most people now, especially the younger demographics where it's actually becoming harder and harder to get on that property ladder, it means that when you retire, basically you might go through the entirety of your life without having any exposure to the property market, direct exposure. So and what that means when you do get to retirement, you're going to be paying rent. So for us, it made a lot of sense to go, okay, how can we actually expose our superannuation to the property market? Like, can we do this? Can we make a superannuation product that makes sense? Spent a lot of time, and when I'll talk about this in the execution, but it's been actually a very long journey just to get to this point. So just to explain a bit further exactly who we are. So we're a super fund. That's the boring sort of headline. Most people, kind of have a little yawn or whatever and switch off. But the way we describe ourselves, it's basically, think of us the same way you think of any other super fund out there. You've got your MLCs, AMPs, you've got industry funds, Host Plus, Uni Super. So think of us exactly the same way, except for one very important difference, and that's the residential property piece. So we invest in all the same assets as everyone else, and our traditional piece of our pie is very much the same, and our product looks like what your superannuation would currently look like, except for the residential property component. So what do we mean when we say that? Because a lot of people might say, oh, well, there's property in super and certain types of property are already in there, which there are, but we'll actually go over exactly what we are because we're very focused on residential because that's what's going to impact you when you retire. I mean, I don't think anyone here plans on living in an office tower when you retire one day. Like, yes, it's important to have that exposure, but we actually think it's residential that's key. So, okay, we had a few little steps here to step it out, but what I'll do, I'll talk you through. So residential property, what we're doing, we're actually building a diversified portfolio, right? Because when we look at property, we look at Sydney, we look at Melbourne, we look at Brisbane, and all these markets move very differently, right? Like right now, Sydney's at a very sort of toppy point in its cycle. We look at Brisbane, it's just starting to move. But one thing that's very, very hard to achieve in any sort of property strategy is diversification. Because when you look at property, essentially it's expensive, right? As an individual, it's very hard to go out there and go, okay, I'm going to buy a property in Brisbane, I might get one in Sydney, I'll get one in Perth, one in Melbourne. Very, very hard. And some high net worths can do that. But basically what we do as a product, it allows us to then go, okay, we can collectively group all of our members' funds together. We invest a large portion of it in the traditional superannuation assets, but then we take this piece, the residential property piece, and we build our portfolio with that. So that's what's different, right? So basically what we do, we focus on two key things, because most people when they're looking to do residential property investment, typically it's in a single asset, typically they've got a lot of leverage, and typically the time horizon isn't quite the same as superannuation. So with superannuation, for some people here it might be a bit, might be 5-10 years away till you retire, but for a lot of us it's going to be 10, 20, 30, even 40 years for some of the younger guys out here. So what we do, we say, okay, well, why don't we take that long-term view on what's going to happen with the market? So what's going to impact our returns? Number one, house prices. So when we're looking at Sydney, we go, okay, well, can we make investments that over the long term are going to make sense? And then sort of judging by the responses we got earlier, I think so. Like basically, if we say, well, today median house price is 1.15 million in Sydney, is it conceivable that that'll be 1.5, might be 2 million in some of our lifetimes and even above? Yes, it might be. So we think it's important to be exposed to that. And then what's a bit unique about us as well with our property strategy, the rental income. So most people and most property investors, actually show of hands, anyone here have investment property? Cool, quite a few. So basically a large part of your strategy, I imagine, your rental income is going towards servicing your debt, correct? Cool. So where we're a little bit different, and because we're a super fund, we actually take a bit more of a conservative approach. We take that rental income and that goes straight back to our members because we don't actually have any leverage. So what that does for us, it basically means that our house price movements aren't levered, so they're less volatile. It means that if there is a downturn, it won't be impacted as negatively, but on the upside as well, we're just going to move in line with the market. But really importantly for us, it means that rental income, we're actually earning that. So that goes straight back to our members. So when, say a place in Sydney is rented out for $1,000 a week, that money then goes back to member returns. So even in Sydney, right now we're sitting here, expectations are probably not going to see much movement to the upside, maybe even to the downside over the short term. That whole period we're earning rental income. So very quickly, why do we think this is all very important? Look, everyone in here in Sydney knows what's happened, right? No one's going to debate that over the last 20 years property's done extremely well. But no one really knows exactly what's going to happen to the stock market or the property market. And this is why when you think of us, remember we had the pie chart where we had the two pieces? We actually have exposure to both markets, and we think it's very important to have exposure to both stock markets and property, right? And the reason why we think this is extremely important is not because on the upside, look, both asset classes can do very well, but when you look at what can actually go wrong, right? So when we look at the stock market, most people here will remember it. Some of the younger people in the audience might not really remember 2008 and what happened, but I'll give you my experience. So 2006 and 7, the stock market felt a lot like Bitcoin. Everyone was getting into the stock market, trading stocks and making lots of money very, very quickly. And then 2008 happened and it all stopped, right? And then we can all see that. And what's happened to the stock market, it has recovered, but it hasn't recovered to the same places where it was in 2007. It's basically been more than a decade of lost performance. Whereas when we look at what happened to the property market, it went down. It went down 4.5%. It recovered the next quarter, and then it's continued to do very well. But it's not so much the upside we want to focus on. It's more when you come to that retirement point, you actually want to be exposed to asset classes that are going to be able to hold their value to a sense. So if you were planning to retire in 2009 and you had all your superannuation in the stock market, your retirement plans probably changed. So that's why we think it's very, very important to have that property piece, because everyone here, assume everyone here wants to live in a house or an apartment or some type of residential property. And that's why when you get to retirement, we think it's extremely important. Cool, so I'm going to go into execution. Any quick questions? I'll do questions at the end as well, but anything so far? Is everyone clear? Cool. All right, execution. So for us, it's we're right at that post-launch phase. Priyanka had a few phases there. I'll actually talk to similar ones. So for us, basically, I'll take you through a bit of the journey on how we came up with the idea and how we got to today, where we're running a super fund, we're operational, we've got members, we've got money basically being invested. So late 2016, I was looking at the property market from a personal perspective, looking at investments, and I essentially realized it's very, very hard to invest in property, especially as a young person in Sydney, right? Like you can look at Brisbane, you can look at Melbourne, but ultimately I want to live in Sydney, I want exposure to this market, and it's hard, right? So then when we started looking around, and especially I was looking at a lot of my friends, a lot of my friends have gone to Europe lots of times, right? Does anyone here have a few friends who basically got a great Instagram and good Facebook, and yep, in the back, yep, some friends that go to Europe? Perfect. Well, what we found, a lot of people in the sort of the 20-year-old and 30-year-old bracket, like they're enjoying life, right? But then when it comes to property, it's actually very hard, because now to get on the property ladder, you actually need tens, if not hundreds of thousands just to get on the ladder, right? So we said, okay, can we help them? Can we help these people at least get exposure? And then we started looking at superannuation, because whilst you might not have any savings, most people at least have a chunk of money sitting there. It might be $5,000, it might be $10,000, it might be $100,000. Doesn't matter. We basically decided we wanted to design something that wasn't going to exclude anyone from the property market, because that's essentially what's happened. Because a lot of people, as soon as you say superannuation and property, they go straight to self-managed super, which that's fine if you're at that stage and you've got those funds and you can do it. But for most of us in the audience, we're not at that stage, so we just couldn't do it. So we said, no, let's design this for everyone. So when we were originally coming up with the idea, said, okay, cool, let's design something around superannuation and property. Let's see if we can make it work. Basically, we spent several months looking at the market, seeing what else was out there, seeing why no one else had done our idea. That was probably the big one for us. Essentially, when we were looking at the market and going, okay, well, superannuation makes sense, and it especially makes sense with residential property because it's such a long-term horizon, we go, okay, well, surely this makes a lot of sense. Why hasn't a super fund done it before, right? Now, are there any guesses as to why we haven't existed previously? Anyone? I'll question, so you said the return on property is very low, correct? Mm. Yep. 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 So I'll focus on, you basically, like the big thing there, you said the returns don't stack up, essentially, right? But what we've seen is that's actually not the case, especially when you look at, you talk about yield, because you can invest in the stock market, you can invest in Telstra, and you can get the yield straight away. You can. And with property, yes, in Sydney, the yield is low, right? But what we focus on is, because you have to look at both the capital component and the yield, because they're both very important, and like, if you're using leverage and stuff and you've got tax deductions, these do work differently. But the way we look at this, we go, okay, well, we're actually looking at both factors, right? So yes, if I was just trying to get yield, like I can tell you lots of stocks that yield a lot more than property. But the reason why we're focused on the property component, look, and I got to be clear, I can't bash stocks because most of our portfolio actually is stocks. So we actually need to talk about that. But when we look at this, when we look at stock yields, we can look at an infrastructure stock that has a great yield. But what can actually happen there as well is that volatility. And that's why we think it's important to have both, right? So that's why when we go, okay, well, why hasn't this been done? Like the actual performance wasn't one of them, because we come through a period as well where if you've been in property, it has outperformed significantly. And the way we look at that on the downside as well, we have both the capital and the yield, right? And stocks have both as well. But then basically stocks on the capital side haven't performed as well. So take the point. Are there any other questions as to why it hasn't been done?
I guess one problem is the unit that you're investing in isn't something that's well understood, because every single property is different, so
Yep.
it requires a very high transaction cost.
Yep.
And so you have to be investing in a colossal amount of real estate to actually end up smoothing out the uncertainty of any single transaction, which means you need to be very, very big.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right as well. So I'll talk about it in terms of concentration risk, right? So a lot of super funds, they actually do this. They actually do invest in property, but like what they do, it comes down to they'll buy like a block of like 80 units, and they actually have that concentration risk. And this it's not really the point you made, but actually this is one of the reasons why they don't do it. It's a lot of hard work. And you said you need to get a lot of scale. That actually requires a lot of man hours and a hell of a lot of work. So that's actually the way they look at it. They go, well, they've got a very small piece in a typical superannuation fund, but it's actually that the point you made about it being very large and needing to have that scale and diversity. It's actually very, very hard and costly to achieve that on the operational side. Because like as a superannuation fund, you can only charge certain fees, and then you need to basically figure out your cost structure to go, okay, does this work, right? So that's actually, it wasn't quite the point you made, but like I've kind of segued there. So why superannuation funds haven't done it is because it's hard. That's one of the reasons. And the second reason why, when we basically spoke to a lot of them and spoke to a lot of the industry, why they said, no, don't worry about it. Their response was that most superannuation members, or their important members, already have a big exposure to residential property through their home, right? And then when you drill into that, it's because basically their important members have, their house, they're in their 50s or 60s, and they've got a few $1 million in property already. So basically the two main reasons where it's hard, because to actually get that scale that you spoke about, it is tough. You need to put in a lot of work. And then the focus of where they're actually allocating is for the members that are closer to retirement. So those are the main reasons why. So when we're talking about ideas, and I guess with this course here, the hard thing with ideas is whenever you pitch something to anyone, there's backlash. And not everyone's going to agree. Some people are going to love it. Sometimes you have to go with the gut feel, as you spoke about with your sort of pricing and marketing. And the hard thing for us, and I guess the challenging thing for myself, when you do speak to a lot of people, and especially about anything that's somewhat controversial, is people aren't always going to believe in it. And I think one of the one of the hardest things that when I was talking about this idea and I was pitching it and talking to people, one of the hardest not bits of feedback, but one of the hardest comments I got was that an idea is worthless, right? When we're talking about execution, basically, like, you'll go out and you'll sell your dream and you'll say, oh, well, we're doing this for these reasons and this is what we're trying to change and this is what we're trying to achieve and we're trying to basically have this positive impact. A lot of people will basically say, oh, that's cool, don't believe in it, whatever. And that's why I actually think execution is extremely important, because from our perspective, a lot of people have ideas. Everyone's got an idea, but it's actually the taking of an idea and building it and actually bringing it to market. That's where you actually create value. So the way we look at it, and this is the one comment I got, an idea is worthless. Basically, that comment, it sucked. It was a crappy comment to get. Didn't enjoy getting it. But from that, we actually said, okay, well, taking that feedback, what does that actually mean? Because it wasn't given in a negative sense. So we actually took that, and the way I like to phrase it now is that through execution, you breathe life into your idea, right? You bring it to life. And unless you do that, unless you put in all the work and nurture it, it's not going to have any value because it'll just stay in your head. So for us, I saw one of the key points you had on the unit outline is one of the decisions to buy or build. Let's do buy or build. What's better? Buy? Any general consensus, or build? Buy? Depends. Anyone else? Cool, I actually like those answers, so we'll go with that. I think it does depend. Depends on what skills you have and basically what resources you have available to you as well. So the way we were setting this up, we basically approached it on a very lean model, because if we were going to be running a superannuation fund, there's lots of different factors. We need to basically build it as a lean vehicle. And if we hired people, whilst that might be better, I actually didn't have the personal resources or capabilities to sometimes decide if a certain developer was the right person, a certain technology was going to be right. So what we did, we actually said, okay, well, where possible, let's partner with corporates or entities that can deliver on a product, and even if there are hiccups, they've got a contractual obligation to deliver. So this is very hard, and as a startup dealing with corporates, it's actually pretty challenging, and it was a bit trial and error. I think some things we got a bit lucky on, some things turned around and sucked. So I'll actually take you through some of those incidents very, very quickly. So I'll show you quickly our stakeholders. So these are all the entities that we have to deal with on a daily basis to bring a superannuation business to life. So from that, we've got tech providers, we've got trustees, we've got custodians, we've got lawyers, we've got banks, got other asset managers, advisors, and so on. There's a whole bunch there. I'll focus just on one or two just to give you a little sense. So GBST, sort of top left for you. So what they are, they're a listed company. They're a software provider. They provide payment gateways and financial technologies and tools. They build a lot of the financial tools for Macquarie, ANZ, BT. We were chatting to them because part of our technology as a super fund, if someone comes on our website and says, cool, I'd like to sign up, this is interesting, we actually can take your information, we need your tax file number, and we can go find your super. So if you've got a few lost accounts out there, we can say, hey, Jimmy, you've got $20,000 here, $3,000 here, $6,000 there. What would you like to do with it? So we were talking to them about their consolidation service. But then basically when I was chatting to them, they said, oh, hey, well, what are you doing for front end? And I was like, this is very early on in the piece. We're like, well, we might hire some developers, we might build it. Don't know yet. And they actually said, well, hey, look, we actually acquired this little business called Emu a year ago, and they're a front end business. So does that make sense to you? Basically, as we went on the journey with them, that whole buy or build for us became very much a buy and contract away a lot of our costs. And what it does for us, it does mean that certain bits of our technology stack we don't own or control, but basically those pieces are commodities. We could, if we needed to move to another provider, we could. So we were very happy to make that decision, and whilst it does increase our business risk to them as a counterparty, it also reduces my personal risk in terms of hiring, because whilst I'd like to think if I met a developer, I could say, yeah, cool, I think you could build an awesome front end, I actually have no idea, right? So it removes that risk. And what it does, it also means that our members, rather than having an internal stack that has been built by some guys who've kind of been winging it and maybe didn't know what they're doing because I didn't know when I was hiring, we have an ASX listed company that basically has bank level security, and build systems for banks, and they build our platform. So we can basically go to sleep at night going, okay, cool, nothing's going to go wrong, because if anything does go wrong, we're not on the hook. It's actually with this bank level business that services essentially investment banks, retail banks, and a few of the other asset managers. So that was our journey. There was a few other little hiccups along the way. I think nothing's ever really smooth. We had a few of our, actually very quickly, so GBST, and there was going to be another entity that was going to provide a big piece of our software. They had a corporate tussle, and there's always going to be unforeseen issues in any execution. I think everyone has a plan, and doing a business plan and marking it all out and having milestones is extremely important, but be aware there's always going to be hiccups, no matter what. I don't think anything's gone as smoothly as we planned, but I think when we look back, it actually all went smoother than we hoped. So it was very nice. It's kind of, plan for the best and prepare for the worst, one of those ones. But so what happened for us? We basically very quickly on the timeline, October we had the idea. It took close to a year to actually get it to the point where we were fully committed, we'd raised some money and we started building. And then from July, it took, again, another 9 months to actually bring the idea to life. So, and when I say bring it to life, we're now an operational super fund. We've got members, we've got money that we're managing for them. So, but we kind of feel we're just at the starting line, right? So Priyanka spoke about the different steps. We're now at the point where we've had our launch, which basically we're in the market. We've now, started doing marketing. But for us, our launch is almost in a two-phased approach because we now have members, but we spoke about, I'll bring it back to the residential property piece. We're now in the market and we're actually looking, and our team is going, okay, well, what are the best investments for our members? Like, how are we going to start constructing this portfolio? And for us, when we go, okay, in 12 months, when we've got, quite a few assets, that's a lot easier than to continue to add, but the very first few, because they essentially set the scene for who we are and how we'll be judged, we need to think about those investments extremely carefully, because if we invest in something that isn't, I'll say like a no-brainer for the general public, and they go, hang on, why did you pay $2 million for that asset? That doesn't make sense to me. That's going to be very hard for our business. So whilst our first properties need to be amazing investments, we need to also be very, very careful from a marketing standpoint as to what we do. So now the interesting thing for us, now we're actually in that post-launch execution phase, which for us is the really important one. We spent all this time building it. Now we actually need to turn our idea and turn our platform into a real business. So it's actually this, I know these are some topics you'll have coming up, but I'll just cover them quickly because for us, this is sort of what we focus on every day now. It's the first one for our business, and the most important one is acting as an investment firm. And the second one, which is a bit more fun, is actually acting as a marketing firm because we're direct to retail, direct to consumer. So we actually need everyone to understand who we are, what we do, and that we exist. So we basically, it's a bit embarrassing because it's got me on it, but now it's all about marketing, public relations, PR, and it's essentially getting the message out there because as a superannuation fund, we've got some very big and stiff competition. The biggest super funds, the biggest one is worth more than $100 billion in terms of AUM, and they're essentially competing with us when it comes to advertising. So we need to think about it in a very different way and go, okay, well, what edge do we have? And that's where I think hopefully in the very near future, when we actually start executing on some of our marketing edge with the properties, where we'll actually stand out. So I guess I'll wrap it up here. For us, execution was a multi-stage process. We basically went from original idea, we then had the build out of the idea, then we had the execution phase of actually building the platform, which for us, it was hard and it took a long time, right? Like building it in the end almost took 2 years. So our execution to date has been about getting to the starting line. We've just started. And now the real execution in actually building the product for us has just started. So we're really excited. If anyone is interested, check out our website, have a look around. I really like our platform and there's a lot of hard work to get it to this point. And anyone who just wants to follow the journey and see what we actually are investing in and what we're doing, go to Instagram and Facebook. So I'll leave you with my 2 quotes. One is that an idea will never realize its true value unless you breathe life into it. And the second one, it's the execution of an idea that makes it valuable. So I'm actually catching up tomorrow with the gentleman that told me that an idea is worthless and told me that my idea was worthless until I actually did something. So it's always a fun chat. He's also going through his own execution phase, but thank you very much. I'll leave it at that.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Grant. Let's get another big round of applause for Grant.